There is an animal alive right now, living in the cold, shallow waters off the coast of nearly every continent on Earth, that has 9 brains. Not one brain with 9 regions. 9. A central brain, and then 8 more, one inside each arm, each one capable of processing information, making decisions and directing movement entirely on its own, without waiting for permission from the centre. The central brain, as best we can tell, does not fully know what the arms are doing at any given moment. The arms taste what they touch before the signal ever reaches the head. They navigate obstacles, grip prey, and solve spatial problems through their own local networks of neurons. Networks that operate with a degree of independence that neuroscientists are still struggling to fully describe. We have a word for what this animal is doing. We call it intelligence. But the more carefully scientists look at how the octopus works, the less confident they are that the word fits, or that the word was ever as precise as we thought it was. Intelligence, in the way most of us understand it, is something that happens in a brain, a single, centralized organ. Neurons talking to other neurons in dense, organized loops, information flowing up through sensory systems, getting processed somewhere in the middle, and then flowing back down as behavior. That is the architecture we know. That is the architecture vertebrate life, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals, has been refining for hundreds of millions of years. It is the architecture that produced language, tools, culture, and self-awareness. It is the architecture inside your skull right now as you follow these words. The octopus does not have that architecture. It never did. The lineage that eventually produced the octopus diverged from the lineage that produced vertebrates roughly 700 million years ago, before complex nervous systems existed in either branch. Whatever intelligence the octopus developed, it developed from scratch, on its own terms, under entirely different evolutionary pressures, arriving at a solution that looks nothing like ours but produces results that are, in some ways, just as remarkable. An octopus can open a childproof pill bottle. It can unscrew a jar from the inside. It learns to navigate mazes, distinguish individual human faces, and remember those faces for weeks. It uses tools. It plans ambushes. It plays. According to research published in 2022 by the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole, octopuses enter what appears to be a REM-like sleep state, during which their skin pulses with rapid dynamic colour changes, suggesting something resembling active dreaming, though what an octopus might dream of remains entirely beyond our reach, and yet this animal is, by most measures, completely alone in its intelligence. It does not live in social groups. It does not have parents that teach it. It does not accumulate culture across generations. It lives for 1 to 3 years, reproduces once, and dies. There is no library of learned behaviour passed down the line. Every octopus essentially builds its cognitive abilities from nothing over the course of a very short life, with a nervous system whose majority, roughly 2/3 of its 500 million neurons, lives not in any brain at all, but distributed across 8 arms that extend into the world and encounter it directly. The question this raises is not simply how the octopus thinks. The question is what thinking actually is, and whether we have been defining it too narrowly, building our entire framework of mind around the one example we could examine most easily, ourselves. In a 2025 study published in Scientific Reports, researchers tracked 25 wild octopuses and confirmed that individual arms show consistent behavioural specialisation. Certain arms were preferentially used for certain tasks. That specialisation was repeatable, individual and independent of central neural instruction, meaning the arms themselves had preferences, or at minimum stable local patterns of engagement with the world that persisted across time and context. The researchers described this as evidence of peripheral cognitive processing at a scale not previously documented in any invertebrate. The United States Navy has taken notice. A program with a current budget of $7.5 million is actively attempting to build what engineers have called a cyber octopus, a robotic system modelled on the distributed neural architecture of the octopus arm network, designed for underwater navigation in complex environments where a centralised controller would be too slow, too rigid, and too fragile. The engineers studying octopus neuroscience are not doing so out of curiosity. They are doing so because nothing we have built yet moves or thinks the way an octopus does, and they want to understand why. This film follows that question into deep territory. We will look at how the octopus nervous system actually works, how 9 semi-independent processing centres communicate or fail to communicate, and what kind of behaviour emerges from that arrangement. We will examine what evolutionary pressures could have produced this solution, and what it tells us about the range of possible minds that life on this planet has actually produced. And we will sit with a question that becomes harder to dismiss the longer you look at it. If intelligence can emerge from a body like this, distributed and decentralised and perpetually short-lived, then what exactly are we calling intelligence, and who else might have it in ways we have not yet learned to see? Welcome to Omni, a space for those who wonder why life exists the way it does. Each film is a story about connection, chaos, and discovery. If that kind of exploration speaks to you, like the video, leave a thought in the comments and subscribe to keep exploring with us. To understand what is unusual about the octopus nervous system, it helps to start with what a nervous system is typically trying to do. All complex animals face the same fundamental problem. The body is large, the environment is unpredictable, and the gap between sensing something and responding to it must be as small as possible. Evolution has solved this problem across most animal lineages in a broadly consistent way. Sensory organs collect information. That information travels to a centralized processing structure, a brain, where it is integrated, prioritized, and used to generate a response. The response then travels back out through the motor system and becomes behavior. The whole system is hierarchical. The brain is at the top. Everything else reports to it. This is the vertebrate solution, and it is extremely old. The earliest identifiable vertebrate nervous systems appear in the fossil record around 500 million years ago in jawless fish-like creatures that were already organising their neurons into distinct brain regions. From that starting point, the vertebrate brain evolved in a largely conservative direction, adding complexity, adding layers, adding new structures built on top of old ones, but always maintaining the core principle, one central processing organ, in the head, in charge of the whole organism. The octopus, and the broader cephalopod class it belongs to, arrived at a completely different arrangement. To understand how different, you need to understand the scale of the divergence. The last common ancestor of a human and an octopus was, in all probability, a small, soft-bodied, flatworm-like creature that lived in shallow Cambrian seas approximately 700 million years ago. It had no brain in any meaningful sense. It may have had a loose network of nerve cells, some basic light sensitivity, some capacity to respond to touch, nothing more. From that point, 2 separate evolutionary experiments began. One produced the vertebrates, or our line. The other produced the mollusks, and eventually, within that lineage, the cephalopods. Both experiments arrived at complex nervous systems, but they arrived through completely separate paths, under completely separate pressures, building on completely separate genetic and developmental foundations. Whatever the octopus brain is, it was not built by modifying anything we would recognize. It was built from scratch, over hundreds of millions of years, by evolution responding to the specific demands of being a soft-bodied predator with no shell, no armor, no speed advantage, and no colony to retreat to. The result is an animal with roughly 500 million neurons, comparable in number to a dog or a small primate, but distributed across its body in a way that has no parallel in vertebrate anatomy. The central brain, a donut-shaped structure wrapped around the esophagus in the middle of the octopus's body, contains approximately 170 million neurons. The remaining 330 million are located elsewhere, in the optic lobes behind the eyes, and most significantly, in the 8 brachial ganglia, one embedded in the base of each arm. Each of those ganglia contains tens of millions of neurons. They are not relay stations. They are not simple reflex circuits. According to work by Dr. Binyamin Hochner at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has spent decades studying cephalopod neuroscience, each arm ganglion constitutes a semi-autonomous processing center capable of receiving sensory input from the suckers, integrating that input, and generating coordinated motor output, all without requiring input from the central brain. This has been demonstrated directly in laboratory conditions. A severed octopus arm, separated from the central brain entirely, continues to respond to stimuli for up to an hour. It withdraws from aversive contact. It grasps at objects placed near the suckers. It performs coordinated reaching movements, the motor programs required for. These behaviours are stored locally, in the arm itself, and they execute without central direction. The arm, in other words, knows what it is doing. The brain does not need to tell it. This creates an organisational structure that engineers who study it describe as federated rather than hierarchical. The central brain sets broad goals and motivational states. It decides, in some general sense, that the animal is hunting, or fleeing, or exploring. But the execution of those goals is delegated almost entirely to the periphery. The arms themselves handle the details, the grip, the texture assessment, the navigation around obstacles, the fine manipulation of whatever the octopus is interacting with. The central brain receives summaries, not raw data. It issues intentions, not instructions. What this means, practically, is that the octopus body operates as something closer to a committee than a monarchy. 9 decision-making centres, running semi-independently, coordinating through a combination of direct neural communication and mechanical coupling. The physical forces that travel through the arms themselves when one of them moves. The central brain can intervene, and does, but much of the octopus's behaviour at any given moment is being generated from the periphery inward, rather than from the centre outward. The implications of this architecture extend beyond neuroscience. For decades, research into animal cognition operated on an implicit assumption that intelligence scales with the brain: bigger brain, more intelligence, more centralised processing power, more sophisticated behaviour. This assumption was not arbitrary. In vertebrates, it holds reasonably well. Across mammals, there is a broad correlation between brain-to-body ratio, a measure called the encephalization quotient, and behavioural complexity. Primates cluster at the top of that scale. Humans are an outlier even within the primates, but the octopus does not fit this model. Its central, brain alone, measured against body size, would not predict the behavioural complexity it actually displays. The model breaks down because the model was calibrated on vertebrates, and the octopus is not a vertebrate. Its intelligence, to the extent that word applies, is not located in any single structure. It is a property of the whole system. The central brain, plus the arm ganglia, plus the skin, plus the distributed sensory apparatus of the suckers, all of it working in parallel, all of it processing information simultaneously. According to Dr. Jennifer Mather at the University of Lethbridge, who has studied octopus behaviour and cognition for more than 4 decades, this distributed processing may actually confer advantages that centralised systems cannot easily replicate. In an interview published in the journal Animal Cognition in 2023, Mather described the octopus nervous system as optimised for real-time interaction with complex physical environments. Environments where the speed of central processing is a bottleneck, and where distributing computation to the periphery allows faster, more adaptive responses. The arm does not need to wait for the brain to process what the suckers are feeling. It processes it locally and acts. This is precisely why the United States Navy's interest in the octopus architecture is not metaphorical. A centralised robot, operating in an underwater environment full of irregular surfaces, moving obstacles and unpredictable currents, faces a genuine computational problem. The centre cannot process fast enough to keep up with what the periphery is encountering. The octopus, through 700 million years of independent evolution, arrived at a solution to that problem. 9 brains, loosely coordinated, each responsible for its own domain, each fast enough to act without waiting for consensus. What is harder to quantify, and what occupies a growing number of researchers working at the intersection of neuroscience and philosophy of mind, is the question of what this architecture means for the octopus's subjective experience, if it has one. If the arms are making decisions, processing sensory input, and generating behaviour without the central brain's involvement, where exactly is the octopus? Is it in the central brain? Is it somehow distributed across the whole system? Is there a unified experiential perspective anywhere in this animal, or something more fragmented, more plural, more difficult to name? Those questions do not have answers yet, but they are being asked seriously and with increasing urgency by researchers who have spent enough time watching octopuses to feel that the questions matter. The octopus did not always look like this. The ancestors of modern cephalopods were shelled animals. The nautilus, which still exists today, largely unchanged from its ancient form, gives us the closest living window into what the early cephalopod body plan looked like. A coiled shell, a small cluster of tentacles. At the opening, a relatively simple nervous system, a slow and heavily armoured life. The shell was protection. It was also a constraint. It limited mobility, limited flexibility, limited the range of environments the animal could exploit. Roughly 275 million years ago, in the lineage that would eventually produce octopuses and squid, the shell began to reduce. In octopuses, it disappeared almost entirely. A pair of small vestigial remnants called stylets are the only structural evidence it was ever there. What replaced the shell as a survival strategy was not armour or speed. It was something more unusual: behavioural flexibility, the ability to be, at any given moment, whatever the environment required. This transition created an immediate and intense pressure on the nervous system. A shelled cephalopod can afford a simpler brain. The shell handles a significant portion of the survival problem. An unshelled octopus living in open water or on complex reef and seafloor terrain has no such buffer. Every moment of its life is a real-time computation problem. What is this surface? Is this gap wide enough to fit through? Is that shadow a predator or a rock? How do I hold this prey item, which is larger than my mouth and covered in hard shell, using arms that have no bones? How do I change colour, texture and shape fast enough that the animal 2 body lengths away does not register me as a distinct object? The demands on the nervous system multiplied as the shell disappeared, and what evolved in response was not simply a larger central brain, though the cephalopod central brain did grow substantially more complex than that of its shelled ancestors. What evolved was the distribution of neural processing outward, into the body itself. The arms became intelligent because the arms needed to be. A central brain fast enough to micromanage 8 independent limbs simultaneously, each encountering different textures, temperatures and mechanical resistances, would need to be implausibly large and would introduce unavoidable processing delays. Evolution found a different solution: make the arms capable of managing themselves. Dr. Clifton Ragsdale at the University of Chicago, who led the team that published the first full sequencing of the octopus genome in the journal Nature in 2015, described the result as one of the most striking examples of convergent evolution in the animal kingdom. The octopus genome contains a large expansion of genes, coding for proteins involved in neural development and synaptic function, genes that, in vertebrates, are associated with the development of complex brains. In the octopus, those same genes appear to have been recruited not just for the central brain, but for the peripheral nervous system, helping to build the sophisticated local processing networks of the arm ganglia. Evolution used similar molecular tools to build something structurally completely different. The 2015 genome paper also identified something else that has continued to generate scientific interest. The octopus genome is unusually dynamic. It undergoes a process called RNA editing at a rate far higher than almost any other animal, including humans. RNA editing is a mechanism by which the instructions encoded in DNA are modified before they are used to build proteins. In most animals, this process is relatively rare. In octopuses, it appears to be a primary mechanism of adaptation, allowing the nervous system to modify its own functional properties in response to environmental conditions, including temperature, without changing the underlying DNA. A 2023 study by researchers at the Marine Biology Laboratory and Tel Aviv University found that octopuses in colder water significantly upregulate RNA editing in their neurons to maintain proper neural function, adjusting their own molecular machinery in real time to compensate for the physical effects of temperature on protein function. This is not a small finding. It means the octopus nervous system is, in a sense, rewriting itself on the fly. The hardware is adapting to the environment not through evolution across generations, but through molecular adjustments within the lifetime of a single animal. The nervous system is not static. It is a moving target, tuned continuously to the conditions the animal is actually living in. All of this helps explain the scale of what the octopus can do with its body, but it does not fully explain the most visually arresting of its abilities, which remains, the more carefully you look at it, one of the most perplexing biological phenomena documented in any animal. The octopus is colourblind. Its eyes contain only a single type of photoreceptor, meaning they cannot distinguish wavelengths of light the way colour-capable eyes do. By every standard model of colour vision, the octopus should perceive the world in something like monochrome, and yet it can match with remarkable precision the colour, texture, brightness, and pattern of almost any surface it encounters: coral, sand, rock, algae, even artificial materials it has never encountered in its evolutionary history. Within less than a second of contact, the mechanism by which a colourblind animal produces accurate colour camouflage is a problem that has occupied researchers for decades without a fully satisfying resolution. Several hypotheses have been proposed. One, advanced by researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara and published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in 2016, suggests that the octopus eye, despite having only one photoreceptor type, may exploit a phenomenon called chromatic aberration, the way lenses focus different wavelengths of light at slightly different depths, to extract colour information by rapidly adjusting the focal depth of the pupil. This would be an entirely novel mechanism of colour perception, one that does not exist in any other known animal using the optical imperfection of the eye as a source of information rather than a limitation. A second hypothesis, supported by work from researchers at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, focuses on the skin itself. The octopus skin contains light-sensitive proteins called opsins, the same class of proteins used in eyes, distributed across its surface. There is accumulating evidence that the skin can detect light independently of the eyes and potentially extract information about ambient light wavelengths through a distributed whole-body sensing system. This would mean the octopus is not just seeing with its eyes, it may be seeing, in some functional sense, with its entire surface, integrating light information from thousands of points across the body to build a representation of the colour environment that the central visual system alone could not construct. Neither hypothesis has been conclusively proven. Both may be partially true. The honest state of the science is that we do not yet fully understand how a colourblind animal produces colour-accurate camouflage in under a second. What we do know is that it does, consistently, reliably, across hundreds of species of cephalopod in every ocean on the planet. The camouflage system itself is worth examining in detail, because it is not a single mechanism but a layered integration of neural, muscular and cellular systems operating simultaneously. The colour and pattern of the octopus skin are controlled by chromatophores, pigment-containing cells, each one controlled by a dedicated set of muscles, which expand or contract to reveal or conceal the pigment. A typical octopus has hundreds of thousands of chromatophores across its body. Each one can be individually addressed. Beneath the chromatophore layer, cells called iridophores create structural colour through interference effects, the same optical phenomenon that produces iridescence in butterfly wings and soap bubbles, and beneath those, leucophores scatter, light broadly to create white and pale tones. The skin is in effect a display system of extraordinary resolution, but what generates the patterns on that display is the nervous system, specifically a set of skin patterning networks that researchers believe are distributed across the body in a way that mirrors the distribution of motor control in the arms. The skin patterns are not computed centrally and then transmitted to the periphery. Evidence from work by Dr. Roger Hanlon at the Marine Biological Laboratory, arguably the world's leading expert on cephalopod camouflage, suggests that local skin networks can generate coherent texture and contrast patterns with minimal central instruction. The skin, like the arms, processes information and produces behaviour on its own terms. What the octopus achieves through all of this, in the moment it settles onto a surface and disappears, is not just camouflage. It is a form of real-time environmental computation, a continuous full-body process of sensing, integrating and responding to the physical world at a speed and resolution that no centralised system could produce. The 9 brains are not separate from this. They are part of it. The animal is not a brain using a body. It is a body that thinks. In September 2025, a study published in Scientific Reports described the results of behavioural observations conducted on 25 wild octopuses across multiple sites in the Mediterranean. The researchers were not looking at the nervous system directly. They were watching how octopuses used their arms, which arms, in what order, for what tasks, and whether those patterns were consistent across individuals and across time. What they found was a level of arm use specialisation that the study's authors, led by a team at the Stazione Zoologica Anton Dohrn in Naples, described as evidence of lateralised peripheral cognition. individual octopuses showed consistent preferences for specific arms in specific contexts. Certain arms were used preferentially for initial contact with novel objects. Others were more frequently deployed during prey capture. Others tended to anchor the animal during manipulation tasks. These preferences were not random. They were stable within individuals across multiple observation sessions, and they varied between individuals, meaning that two octopuses encountering the same situation might use different arms, in the same way that two humans reaching for an object might use different hands. The significance of this finding goes beyond the observation itself. In vertebrates, behavioral lateralization, the tendency to favour one side of the body for certain tasks, is associated with functional asymmetry in the brain. Left hemisphere dominance in humans is linked to language and fine motor control. Right hemisphere dominance is linked to spatial processing and certain forms of emotional regulation. The lateralization is centrally organised. It reflects something about how the brain itself is structured and how it allocates processing resources across its two hemispheres. In the octopus, the lateralization appears to be peripheral. The preference is not located in the central brain, or at least not only there. It appears to be a property of the arm ganglia themselves, or of the communication pathways between specific ganglia and the central brain, or some combination of both that researchers have not yet fully disentangled. What is clear is that the arms are not interchangeable. Each arm has a functional identity that is at least partially stable and at least partially self-organised, emerging from the local processing networks embedded within the arm rather than from top-down assignment by the central brain. This raises a question about what learning looks like in a system like this. In vertebrate animals, learning is understood primarily as a process of synaptic change in the brain, the strengthening and weakening of connections between neurons in response to experience. The brain changes and behaviour changes with it. The locus of learning is central. In the octopus, if the arms are processing information and generating behaviour independently, then learning, or something functionally equivalent to it, may be occurring in the periphery as well as the centre. The arm ganglia may be modifiable by experience in ways that alter local behaviour without requiring changes in the central brain. Direct evidence for this remains limited, but the behavioural data is consistent with it. Octopuses trained on tactile discrimination tasks, in which they must distinguish between objects by touch alone, without visual input, show learning curves and retention profiles that suggest the suckers and their associated local circuits are involved in the storage and retrieval of tactile memories. Work by Dr. Graziano Fiorito at the Stazione Zoologica, published across several studies examining learning and memory in Octopus vulgaris, found that octopuses could retain tactile discrimination learning for weeks, and that the retention was disrupted by interventions targeting the arm ganglia as well as by interventions targeting the central brain. The memory, in other words, was not stored in one place. What this means for cognition in the broader sense is still being worked out, but it complicates, in a useful way, the standard model of how learning and memory work. We tend to think of memory as something the brain holds, a record stored centrally, retrieved on demand. The octopus suggests an alternative. Memory is something distributed across the body, stored partly in the periphery, retrievable through the body's own engagement with the world. The arm, when it reaches toward a familiar surface, may already know something about that surface, not because the brain told it, but because the arm itself has been there before. Against all of this complexity, there is a fact about the octopus that becomes harder to absorb the longer you consider it. This animal, with its 500 million neurons, its distributed cognition, its capacity for learning and memory and individual behavioural variation, lives for 1 to 3 years. Most species reproduce once. The female broods her eggs, aerating them continuously for weeks or months, eating nothing during that time. When the eggs hatch, she dies. The male, in most species, dies within months of mating. There is no second generation that the parent will ever encounter. There is no transfer of learned behaviour from parent to offspring. There is no culture, no tradition, no accumulated wisdom passed down a lineage. Every octopus builds everything it knows from nothing in a life that most vertebrates would consider barely a beginning. In evolutionary biology, the life history trade-offs that produce short-lived, high-investment reproduction strategies are well understood in broad terms. An organism that reproduces once and then dies, a strategy called semal parity, typically does so in environments where adult survival beyond reproduction is unlikely anyway, making further investment in the adult body inefficient. Energy is redirected from self-maintenance into reproduction, maximising the number and quality of offspring from a single reproductive event. Pacific salmon follow this strategy. Many insects do. It is not, in itself, unusual. What is unusual is the combination of semal parity with the level of cognitive complexity the octopus has developed. Almost every other highly intelligent animal on the planet is long-lived. Primates, cetaceans, elephants, corvids, parrots. They are all animals where learning accumulates over years and decades, where the brain's capacity for complex behaviour pays off through a long life of refined skill and social navigation. The intelligence and the longevity appear, in vertebrates, to be linked. A large, complex brain is an expensive organ to maintain, and it tends to be worth maintaining only if the animal lives long enough to amortize that investment through accumulated learning. The octopus defies this logic. Its nervous system is expensive. Roughly 500 million neurons require significant metabolic resources to build and run, but it runs that system for less than 3 years before the whole enterprise terminates. From a strict metabolic accounting perspective, this seems difficult to justify, and yet the octopus persists, across hundreds of species, across every major ocean, as one of the most ecologically successful predator lineages in marine environments. Dr. Peter Godfrey-Smith at the University of Sydney, a philosopher of mind who has spent years studying cephalopod cognition, and wrote extensively about it in his 2016 book on the subject, has described the octopus as a model of what he calls a different kind of mind, one that achieves complexity through mechanisms orthogonal to those vertebrates use, and that challenges the assumption that high intelligence and short lifespans are incompatible. His argument is that the octopus may simply be operating on a different cognitive economy. Rather than investing in long-term memory consolidation and the gradual accumulation of a behavioural repertoire over decades, the octopus nervous system may be optimised for rapid, flexible response to novel situations in the immediate present, an architecture built for intensity rather than duration. If this is right, then the octopus is not a failed attempt at vertebrate intelligence, constrained by a short lifespan. It is a fully realised alternative, a cognitive strategy tuned to a different set of priorities, producing an animal that is extraordinarily capable within its own terms, even if those terms are largely invisible to us because they are so different from our own. There is something genuinely unsettling about this when you sit with it. We have spent most of intellectual history building our understanding of mind on a sample of one, vertebrate cognition, and within that, primarily mammalian and primarily human cognition. The octopus has been here the entire time, living out a completely different answer to the same questions evolution was trying to solve. It has been opening jars and navigating mazes and dreaming in colour for hundreds of millions of years in the cold water beneath everything we built our theories on top of. And we are only now beginning to look at it carefully enough to understand what we have been missing. In a research facility operated by the United States Navy, engineers are trying to build something that does not yet exist. A robot that moves the way an octopus moves. Not a robot that looks like an octopus. Not a robot that mimics the surface behaviour of one. A robot that operates on the same organisational principles. A system in which the intelligence is not concentrated at the centre, but distributed across the body, where each limb manages its own sensing and its own movement, and the whole system coordinates through something closer to negotiation than command. The programme, which carries a budget of $7.5 million and falls under the Office of Naval Research's broader initiative in Bioinspired robotics, has been described in programme documentation as an attempt to translate the octopus's federated neural architecture into an engineerable framework. The goal is a soft-bodied underwater vehicle capable of navigating the kind of complex, cluttered, unpredictable environments, ship hulls, reef structures, wreck interiors, shallow water infrastructure, that conventional rigid body robots handle poorly. The challenge is not mechanical. Soft actuators capable of producing octopus-like movement have existed in prototype form for over a decade. The challenge is computational. The challenge is control. A conventional robot, regardless of how sophisticated its hardware is, relies on a centralized processor that models the environment, plans a movement, sends commands to the actuators, receives sensory feedback, updates the model and repeats. For slow, structured tasks in predictable environments, this works. For fast interaction with an irregular, dynamic physical environment, the kind of environment an octopus navigates as a matter of routine, it breaks down. The central processor becomes a bottleneck. By the time the command to adjust a grip has travelled from the centre to the limb and back, the moment requiring adjustment has already passed. The robot slips, the task fails. The octopus solves this by not routing those decisions through the centre. The arm ganglion detects a change in surface resistance and adjusts the sucker pressure locally without consulting the central brain in milliseconds. The correction happens at the site of the problem, not at the headquarters of the organism. The central brain learns, in a summary sense, that the grip is stable without ever having processed the specific sensory event that produced the stability. What the Navy engineers are working toward is a computational architecture that replicates this. Each limb of the robotic system would carry its own local processor, running its own control loops, capable of executing a library of low-level behaviours, grip, release, reach, brace, without requiring central authorization. The central system would operate at a higher level of abstraction, issuing goal states rather than motor commands, and receiving status summaries rather than raw sensory data. The communication between centre and periphery would be intentionally limited, not because of a hardware constraint, but because limiting it is the point. Forcing the periphery to be self-sufficient is what produces the speed and adaptability the system needs. This inversion of conventional robotic control logic, deliberately reducing central oversight rather than maximising it, is, in engineering terms, a significant conceptual shift. It reflects a growing recognition in robotics research that the vertebrate model of centralised intelligence, which has dominated robotics since the field began, may not be the right model for every problem. Some environments and some tasks may be better served by distributing intelligence into the body itself, accepting local autonomy in exchange for whole system speed and resilience. The octopus arrived at this conclusion through natural selection, not deliberate design. But the conclusion is the same. What makes the Cyber Octopus program scientifically interesting beyond its immediate engineering goals is what it reveals about the gap between understanding the octopus nervous system conceptually and being able to reproduce it functionally. The researchers involved have noted in published program updates that the more carefully they study octopus arm behaviour, the more they realise how much of the arm's capability depends on physical properties of the arm itself, its elasticity, its geometry, its passive mechanical responses to force, rather than on explicit neural computation. The arm is not just a limb controlled by a ganglion. The arm and the ganglion form a coupled system in which the mechanical properties of the tissue do part of the computational work. The flesh itself is part of the intelligence. This concept has a name in robotics and neuroscience: morphological computation. It refers to the idea that the physical form of a body, its shape, its material properties, its passive dynamics, encodes information and performs computation that would otherwise need to be handled by a dedicated neural or electronic processor. A soft, compliant limb that naturally conforms to irregular surfaces offloads some of the grip control problem onto physics. A body that distributes its mass in a particular way offloads some of the balance problem onto mechanics. The brain, or the ganglion, or the central processor does not need to solve those problems explicitly because the body has already solved them structurally. In the octopus, morphological computation is pervasive. The suckers self-seal against surfaces through passive hydraulic mechanics. The arm's muscular hydrostat structure, a muscle system with no rigid skeleton, allows it to stiffen or soften along any portion of its length through local muscle activation, creating a functional joint anywhere it needs one without the constraints of a fixed skeletal geometry. The skin's texture and compliance allow it to conform to irregular surfaces in ways that would require extensive active control in a rigid system. All of this means that when researchers try to extract the octopus's intelligence and put it into a robot, they are not just copying a neural architecture, they are copying an entire body plan, because the body plan and the neural architecture are inseparable. The intelligence is not in the brain, or in the ganglia, or in the skin. It is in the relationship between all of them, and in the relationship between the whole system and the physical world it operates in. This has implications that extend well beyond robotics. It suggests that intelligence, wherever it occurs in the biological world, may be less separable from its physical substrate than our standard models assume. We tend to think of the brain as the site of cognition, with the body as its instrument, a vehicle that the mind inhabits and uses. The octopus challenges this framing not just because it has 9 brains instead of 1, but because even the distinction between brain and body, between computation and physical structure, appears to dissolve when you look at it closely enough. The concept of embodied cognition, the idea that cognitive processes are not confined to the brain but extend into and through the body and its interactions with the environment, has been gaining traction in cognitive science and philosophy of mind for several decades. Its theoretical foundations were laid in part by the philosopher and cognitive scientist Francisco Varela and colleagues in the early 1990s, and it has been developed extensively since then by researchers across neuroscience, psychology, and robotics. But for much of its history, the embodied cognition framework remained somewhat abstract when applied to vertebrate animals, whose brains are so dominant in the overall cognitive picture that the body's contribution is easy to underestimate. In the octopus, embodied cognition is not a theoretical framework. It is an observable, anatomical fact. 2/3 of the nervous system is outside the central brain. The arms make decisions. The skin processes light. The body is not a vehicle for the mind. The body is the mind, distributed and extended across a form that meets the world directly, in every direction, simultaneously. Researchers studying octopus cognition increasingly argue that this makes the animal not just an interesting edge case in the study of intelligence, but a genuinely important reference point for rethinking what intelligence is and where it lives. If we define intelligence as what brains do, then the octopus is a problem, an animal that does intelligent things through a system that does not match our definition. If we define intelligence as what certain kinds of information processing systems do, regardless of their physical organization, then the octopus fits. But then we need to be honest about what else might fit, and whether the boundaries we've been drawing around the concept of mind are the right ones. Dr. Cy Montgomery, a naturalist who spent extended time observing octopuses in captivity and documented her experiences in a 2015 book, noted that the animals she observed appeared to form individual relationships with specific human caretakers, not just learned associations between a person and food, but something that looked more like recognition and differential response. Approaching some individuals readily, avoiding others, displaying what seemed to be preferences and aversions that went beyond simple conditioning. The aquarium staff she worked with described octopuses that would spray specific keepers with water, repeatedly, consistently targeting the same individuals, in a pattern that seemed playful or communicative, though the interpretation of such behaviour is necessarily cautious. Caution is appropriate. Anthropomorphism is a real hazard in animal cognition research. The appearance of preference or personality can emerge from relatively simple behavioural rules, and the temptation to interpret animal behaviour through a human lens is strong enough that researchers in the field work hard to resist it. But the caution has to run in both directions. Dismissing the evidence of individual recognition, directed behaviour, and apparent emotional response in octopuses because they do not fit the expected profile of an intelligent animal is its own form of error, one shaped not by evidence but by the assumption that intelligence must look like us. The nervous system of the octopus does not look like ours. Its life does not look like ours. Its relationship to time, to learning, to the body, to the environment, none of it maps onto the vertebrate template we have been using as a baseline. That does not mean it is lesser. It means it is different, in ways we're only beginning to have the tools and the concepts to describe. In the summer of 2022, researchers at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, published a study that has continued to generate discussion at the edges of neuroscience and philosophy in the years since. The researchers, led by Dr. Eric Ramos and colleagues, had been monitoring sleeping octopuses using high-resolution video, observing not just the animal's stillness, but the activity of their skin during sleep. What they documented was difficult to categorize and harder still to dismiss. During certain phases of sleep, the octopuses underwent rapid, coordinated changes in skin color and texture, flashing through complex patterns, cycling through camouflage displays, contracting and relaxing chromatophores in sequences that looked, to the researchers, like compressed versions of the patterns the animals produced while awake and actively engaged with their environment. The changes were brief, typically lasting between 5 seconds and a minute, and occurred multiple times across a sleep period. Between these active phases, the animals returned to a quiet, pale, still state. The parallels to REM sleep in vertebrates were clear enough that the researchers described the phenomenon using that language, while being careful to note that the analogy was structural rather than confirmed. In vertebrates, REM sleep is associated with memory consolidation, emotional processing, and, in humans, and almost certainly in other mammals, dreaming. The rapid eye movements that give REM sleep its name, the muscle atonia, the elevated brain activity, the vivid subjective experience. All of these are features of a sleep state that vertebrate nervous systems enter regularly, and which appears to serve functions that go beyond simple rest. Whether octopuses dream is a question that cannot currently be answered, because answering it would require access to the octopus's subjective experience, and we have no reliable method for accessing any animal's subjective experience, including our own, in any intersubjective sense. What the 2022 study confirmed is that octopuses enter a sleep state characterized by dynamic neural and skin activity that is broadly consistent with the behavioral profile of REM sleep in vertebrates. What happens inside the octopus during that state, whether there is something it is like to be an octopus moving through those shifting patterns of colour in the darkness, remains, as the researchers noted in their conclusions, an open question. It is an open question of a particular kind. It belongs to the category of problems in consciousness research that the philosopher David Chalmers identified in 1995 as the hard problem, the question of why and how physical processes in a nervous system give rise to subjective experience. The easy problems of consciousness, explaining attention, memory, behavioural flexibility, sensory discrimination, are not actually easy, but they are tractable in principle. They are problems about how information is processed, and information processing is something we know how to study. The hard problem is different. It asks not how information is processed, but why processing information feels like anything at all, why there is an inside to experience, a first-person perspective, a quality to sensation that is not captured by any functional description. We do not have a solution to the hard problem for humans. We do not fully understand why the neural processes that occur in a human brain produce a conscious experience rather than just an unconscious computation. We assume they do because we have access to our own experience directly, and we infer that other humans have similar experiences because they have similar nervous systems and similar behaviours. But the inference is not proof. It is a reasonable assumption built on similarity. With octopuses, the similarities are much harder to establish. The nervous system is different in its architecture, its evolutionary origin, its organisational principles. The behaviour is, in many respects, comparable in its flexibility and apparent intentionality to behaviour we associate with conscious experience in vertebrates. But behaviour alone does not settle the question. Behaviour can be produced by systems that, for all we know, have no inner experience whatsoever. A thermostat responds to its environment. A sufficiently sophisticated robot can navigate a maze. The question is not whether the octopus responds to the world, but whether there is something it is like to be the octopus responding. Researchers who have spent significant time with octopuses often report an intuition that there is. Dr. Jennifer Mather has written that the behavioural evidence for something like emotional states in octopuses is, to her mind, substantial. That the animals show what appear to be fear responses, curiosity responses, frustration responses, that these responses generalise appropriately to novel situations, and that they persist across time in ways consistent with internal states rather than simple reflexes. She's careful, as any scientist must be, to frame these observations in appropriately tentative language. But the tentativeness reflects epistemic honesty, not absence of evidence. What makes the consciousness question particularly strange in the case of the octopus is the distribution problem. Even if we grant, for the sake of argument, that the octopus has some form of subjective experience, the question of where that experience is located becomes genuinely puzzling in a way it is not for vertebrates. In a vertebrate animal, conscious experience is assumed to be generated by the brain, and more specifically by certain circuits within the brain, the cerebral cortex in mammals, analogous structures in birds. The localization is not perfectly established, but there is a working consensus about the general territory. In the octopus, the nervous system does not have an obvious candidate for the seat of experience. The central brain is the most complex single structure, but 2/3 of the neurons are elsewhere, If experience requires neural complexity, it might be distributed. If experience requires integration, the binding together of information from across the system into a unified field, then the relatively sparse communication between the octopus's 9 neural centers raises the question of whether that integration occurs and what form it takes. Some neuroscientists have speculated in provisional terms that the octopus might have something like 9 partially distinct experiential streams, loosely coordinated but never fully unified in the way vertebrate consciousness appears to be. Others find this speculation too unconstrained to be useful, without a more fundamental theory of what consciousness actually requires. Dr. Peter Godfrey Smith has been among the most careful and philosophically rigorous thinkers to engage with these questions. His position, developed across several years of writing and field observation, is that the octopus probably has some form of subjective experience, that this experience is likely to be quite different from vertebrate experience in its structure and character, and that we should resist the temptation to describe it either in anthropomorphic terms or to dismiss it on the grounds that it does not fit our familiar categories. What the octopus offers, in his view, is not just a biological curiosity but a philosophical opportunity, a case study in what minds can be when they are built differently, that might help us understand what minds actually are when they are built in the way we are familiar with. This is the value of the octopus as a scientific object that goes beyond its immediate interest as a remarkable animal. Every framework we have for understanding cognition, consciousness, intelligence, and mind was built on the vertebrate model and primarily on the human model. That framework has been extraordinarily productive. It has also been inevitably constrained by the sample on which it was built. The octopus is not simply an animal that is smart in a different way. It is evidence that the space of possible minds is larger than our frameworks were designed to cover, that intelligence can be distributed rather than centralized, that cognition can live in the periphery as much as the center, that experience, if it occurs at all in this animal, may have a structure we do not have good concepts for yet. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in 2012 by a prominent group of neuroscientists including Stephen Hawking, stated explicitly that non-human animals, including all mammals, birds and many other creatures including octopuses, possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. The declaration was carefully worded. It spoke of substrates that generate consciousness, not of confirmed conscious experience. But its inclusion of octopuses was deliberate, and it signalled a shift in the scientific community's willingness to take the question seriously for animals as neurologically distant from us as cephalopods. Taking it seriously does not mean resolving it. The declaration did not solve the hard problem. It did not tell us whether octopuses have inner lives, or what those inner lives are like, or whether the word inner even applies to an animal whose nervous system extends through its arms and across the surface of its skin. What it meant was that the question is no longer considered safely dismissible, that the evidence for sophisticated neural processing in these animals has reached a threshold where the burden of proof has shifted, and that those who would deny any form of inner experience to the octopus must now engage with the evidence rather than simply citing the evolutionary distance between us. The distance is real. 700 million years of separate evolution is not a small gap. But the octopus is here, on the same planet, in the same water, built from the same biochemistry, solving the same fundamental problems of survival that every living thing has to solve. It built something that works extraordinarily well through means we did not predict and still do not fully understand. Whatever is happening inside it when it sleeps and its skin moves through the colours of its waking life, that is a question worth holding carefully without rushing to an answer we do not yet have. There is a field of research that has emerged at the intersection of neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and philosophy over the last 2 decades, and it is concerned with a problem that the octopus makes concrete in a way that abstract theorizing alone cannot. The problem is this: we do not have a satisfying definition of intelligence, not one that works across all the cases we need it to cover, not one that accurately predicts which systems will exhibit the behaviours we associate with intelligence and which will not one that tells us, when we encounter a new system, biological or artificial, whether intelligence is present, absent, or present in some form we do not yet have language for. The definitions we use in practice tend to be circular, or anthropocentric, or both. Intelligence is what intelligence tests measure, which is to say, intelligence is what humans do well on tasks designed by humans. Alternatively, intelligence is the capacity for abstract reasoning, or for learning from experience, or for solving novel problems, or for flexible behaviour in unpredictable environments. Each of these definitions captures something real, but each of them, applied consistently, either includes systems we are reluctant to call intelligent, or excludes systems we are confident should qualify. The octopus applies pressure to every version of this problem simultaneously. It learns from experience, demonstrably, measurably, with retention periods of weeks. It solves novel problems, jar opening, puzzle boxes, navigation tasks it has never encountered in its evolutionary history. It behaves flexibly in unpredictable environments. This is, in a sense, the entire summary of its lifestyle. By every behavioural criterion we typically apply, it qualifies. But it qualifies through a system that our existing neuroscience was not built to describe. Distributed, peripheral, embodied in a way that makes the boundary between brain and body largely meaningless. This creates pressure not just on our definition of intelligence, but on the methodologies we use to study it. The standard tools of cognitive neuroscience, brain imaging, electrode recording, lesion studies, are designed for brains. They are designed for centralized structures in which specific functions can be localized to specific regions. When you apply those tools to an octopus, you get partial information, because the system you are studying extends far beyond the structure those tools are designed to probe. To understand octopus cognition fully, you would need tools that can simultaneously monitor the activity of 9 semi-independent neural centers, track the sensory processing occurring in hundreds of thousands of suckers, and capture the skin's light-sensing activity, all in a freely moving animal interacting with a naturalistic environment. Those tools do not yet exist in the form required. What does exist is a growing body of behavioural and molecular evidence, accumulated across decades of work by researchers on multiple continents, that points consistently toward the same conclusion. The octopus is doing something cognitively sophisticated that we understand only in outline, using an architecture we understand only in part, producing behaviours whose mechanisms we have not fully mapped. The outline and the partial architecture and the unmapped behaviours are all, individually, more interesting than almost anything else in comparative neuroscience. Together, they constitute one of the most significant open problems in the science of mind. It is worth pausing here to consider what the octopus represents in the broader context of how life has organised information on this planet. Intelligence, in the broad sense of flexible, adaptive, experience-modifiable behaviour, has evolved independently many times. The vertebrate lineage produced it in fish, and then in reptiles, and then in birds and mammals, with increasing elaboration of the central nervous system at each stage. But vertebrates are not the only line. Insects produce behaviours of remarkable complexity. Colony-level computation in social insects, individual learning and navigation in solitary bees, through nervous systems of a few 100,000 to 1 million neurons, organised on principles entirely unlike vertebrates. Cephalopods produced in the octopus a form of individual intelligence that rivals mammals, through a body plan that inverts the vertebrate logic of centralised control. There are researchers who argue that certain plants exhibit forms of adaptive information, processing that deserve to be included in a sufficiently broad definition of cognition, though this remains contentious. The common thread across all of these cases is not architecture. The nervous systems involved share almost nothing structurally. The common thread is function, the capacity to take in information about the environment, integrate it with prior states, and modify behaviour in ways that improve the organism's probability of surviving and reproducing. Evolution found this functional endpoint multiple times, through completely different structural paths. The octopus is the most dramatic example of this convergence, because the endpoint it reached is, by any reasonable measure, so far from what its structural path would have seemed to predict. This is also, increasingly, the context in which researchers studying artificial intelligence are looking at biological systems for insight. The question is not just how to build something that behaves intelligently. The question is how many different structural implementations of intelligence are possible, and whether there are general principles that cut across all of them, architectural universals that hold regardless of whether the system is built from neurons or silicon or something else entirely. The octopus, as the most alien form of intelligence we have access to, is one of the most informative data points available. if there are principles that apply both to the vertebrate brain and to the octopus nervous system, those principles are probably fundamental. If something works in both a centralized primate cortex and a distributed cephalopod ganglion network, it is probably telling us something deep about what intelligence actually requires. Understanding those principles, the deep logic of how information processing systems produce adaptive behavior, is work that spans neuroscience, mathematics, computer science, and philosophy. It is the kind of interdisciplinary problem that benefits from the tools of formal reasoning and quantitative modelling as much as from biological observation. The platform Brilliant has built courses specifically around this kind of systems-level thinking, mathematical reasoning, computational logic, neural networks, and the science of how complex behaviours emerge from structured interactions. For anyone following the questions this film raises and wanting to develop the conceptual vocabulary to think about them rigorously, Brilliant offers a way to build those foundations directly. Their courses are used by learners from the age of 10 through graduate and professional levels, including curriculum developed in partnership with faculty from MIT, Harvard, and Stanford. The approach is built on active problem-solving rather than passive watching, the same principle, interestingly, that appears to underlie how the octopus itself learns: direct engagement with the world, not observation from a distance. You can try Brilliant free for 30 days and get 20% off an annual premium subscription at brilliant.org/omni. The link and QR code are in the description below. What the octopus ultimately forces us to confront is not just a set of scientific questions, but a set of assumptions we carry without examining them. Assumptions about where mind lives, what form it takes, and who else might have it. We built our understanding of intelligence as a tower with the human brain at the top, and we arranged all other cognitive systems beneath it according to how closely they resembled us. The octopus does not fit in that tower, not because it belongs at a lower level, but because it was never built from the same materials or toward the same design. It is a separate structure entirely, standing at an angle to ours, built by a different architect over a different span of time, for different purposes, reaching comparable heights through means that our tower's blueprints do not account for. The octopus lives its entire life in under 3 years. In that time, starting from nothing, with no parental guidance and no cultural inheritance, it builds a behavioural repertoire that includes spatial memory, individual recognition, tool use, camouflage of extraordinary precision, and something that may be dreaming. It manages a nervous system distributed across 9 semi-autonomous processing centres through a coordination mechanism we have not fully described. It navigates environments, solves problems, and interacts with other individuals in ways that reveal stable personality traits varying from animal to animal. And then it dies, having passed none of this explicitly to any offspring, leaving nothing behind but the genes that made it possible. There is something in this that resists easy resolution, a life that burns intensely and briefly, achieving remarkable cognitive complexity in the service of a single reproductive moment, leaving the deep water as unmarked as it found it. From a human perspective, oriented toward accumulation and legacy, and the slow extension of what one generation builds for the next, this life seems almost deliberately stripped of permanence. But permanence is a vertebrate preoccupation. The octopus does not appear to need it. Its nervous system is not built for the long game. It is built for the present, for the immediate, tactile, flickering, colour-shifting reality of now. Perhaps this is the deepest thing the octopus has to tell us. Not just that intelligence can be distributed rather than centralised, or that mind can extend into the body rather than residing above it, or that evolution solves the same problem through radically different structures. Perhaps it is this, that we have been so focused on the form intelligence takes in our own case that we have missed how many other forms it has already taken, quietly, in the cold water beneath us, for longer than our own form has existed. We began this film by asking what it means that an animal has 9 brains, that a nervous system can be organised as a federation rather than a monarchy, that the arms of a living creature can know things the head does not. The answer, as best we can assemble it from what science has found, is that it means our definitions are too small. Intelligence is not where we put it. Mind is not what we said it was. The boundaries we drew around these concepts were drawn from the inside of our own experience, using the only nervous system we had direct access to, and they were always going to be insufficient for describing anything that did not share that starting point. The octopus did not share our starting point. It has not shared anything with us for 700 million years. And yet here it is, hunting, learning, sleeping, dreaming in colours it cannot see, managing 9 minds in a body that lives and ends in a single burning season. It is not us. It is not like us. It is something stranger, and in its strangeness, something that asks us to be more honest about what we actually know, and what, for all our intelligence, we have not yet learned to see.